As from the leader perspective, things like narcissism or sociopathy, psychopathy come into play. What can you make of the world we live in, maybe the leaders that run the world from the perspective, from the lens of narcissism?
So I am struck 20 years of doing what I do now. Right? I've been a psychiatrist for 20 years and I practice in so many different settings and I consult in different settings. I've been fortunate to have a very wide purview of like what's going on in people and in the world around us. And I am struck with amazement that of all the things I see that are, say, abnormal, let's say, from the mental health perspective, this could be depression, panic attacks, hearing voices, addiction, but there's so many things, we cover everything, that narcissism is not frequent compared to a lot of other things. So it's small in terms of, say, a narcissistic diagnosis, right? It's much less than many other things, but it causes the lion's share. I don't just mean the most compared to anything else, but I think more than 50%, the majority of bad things, evil things, destructive things that I see in the world around us. I think narcissists are wildly destructive because they are driven completely, they are lodged completely in the lane of envy.
Can you try to sneak up, and we don't want to be lost in definitions, but can you try to sneak up to a definition, non-clinical definition of narcissism that we're talking about?
Yeah. So narcissism is a deep, pervasive, and unquestioned sense of inadequacy in the self that comes along with anger and fear and vulnerability, fear of destruction, fear of annihilation, that is compensated for by aggression, by the mechanics of envy, by trying to make the self seem better at the expense of others, by taking from others, by being completely cavalier to the thoughts and feelings of others. That narcissism is not arrogance. No, narcissism is the opposite of arrogance. There is such a deep sense of inadequacy and incompetence in the self that the defensive structure around that becomes dominated by like rocket-fueled envy.
So the machinery of narcissism is envy, but what do you make of the kind of more popularly discussed kind of symptom of narcissism, which is a seeming not caring about other people, sort of a very inward-facing focus in terms of the calculation you make when making decisions about the world?
Well, narcissistic people definitely care about other people, right? It's the people who are schizoid, right? And say that don't necessarily register other people, right? But narcissism, people care about other people, but it's entirely vis-a-vis the self, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm schizoid, I don't really notice or care much who you are, right? But if I'm narcissistic, I absolutely care because I'm watching every last detail of you. What might you have that's better than me?
Yeah.
Right? It's an incredibly intense focus upon individuals and demographics of people, but the priority, the goal is entirely about the self, which is why it then can become easy to say, oh, I don't care if 1 million people die, right? That's how different is that from going out and destroying one person or 1 million people, right? It's in the same category of those people only, their existence is only meaningful in how it relates to me.
But it's still meaningful. It just seems like a very difficult leap to take, that I don't care that 1 million people die. That seems to be, even with envy, that seems to be a big like feeling and thought to have if you at all care about them. Are other people, I guess, tools for
Right.
alleviation of your sense of inadequacy?
Right. I mean, I don't mean care about in that like being caring at all. I mean, caring about in that noticing that the person exists. Right. I mean, someone who wants money and notices that there's $100 bill out cares about that. Right? They don't care about the $100 bill, and that doesn't mean anything to them. It doesn't have thoughts and feelings, but it's going to attract attention. They care about it because it's something that they want.
Mhm.
right? The same way people will care about others, but only from the perspective of, do you have things that I want? Or can I feel better about myself by taking something from you, by making things worse for you?
People often talk about narcissism as like the opposite of empathy,
Uh-huh.
but sort of empathy, again, depends how you define it, but is a is a careful consideration of the mental space of another person, of how the other person sees the world.
Right.
And so you're kind of saying that narcissistic people would be also be very good at that in order
Right.
to understand how maybe the other person can be manipulated or something to alleviate your sense of inadequacy.
Right. So there's a difference between the mechanics of empathy. So let's say, and we can define things different ways. So let's say empathic attunement is the ability to be attuned and to think, okay, what's going on in you? What might you be thinking? What might you be feeling? There's some people have a lot of empathic attunement, but that's we could look at that as mechanistic, right? It doesn't equate to care, right? An empathic attunement can come along with empathy or not. Right. So yes, people who are narcissistic, they can mentalize well. So you mentalize meaning the ability to understand or to consider thoughts, feelings, motivations in other people. Right. So people who are narcissistic can have empathic attunement or mentalization, depending upon how we want to describe those things. But that has nothing to do with care, with actual empathy or kindness or consideration.
So in that sense, empathy, usually popularly used, means that you care, like your happiness is aligned. There's this, I need to read this book. I've read so little science fiction. That's been one of my goals for this year, to catch up on some science fiction. So Robert Heinlein from Stranger in a Strange Land has this quote about love, which is, love is that condition where another person's happiness is essential to your own.
Yes.
So that's a good definition, I guess, of empathy, where
Yes.
you're very sensitive, so mechanistically very sensitive to the state of another person's mind, and your goal is to maximize their happiness. It's like essential to your own happiness. So the happinesses are aligned, and when that's like elevated to its highest forms, you can call that love, romantic
Yes.
love, and friendship, and so on.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so one more thing about the narcissist
Yes.
is some people can be sort of benign narcissists where they want great things for themselves, right? But if they have enough great things, they can sort of tolerate others being happy too. Right? and you know, these are people who sometimes are actually quite highly liked, right?
Yeah.
Because they have to have the most money, the most power, the most of anything more than anyone else could challenge.
Yeah.
But as long as I have that, it's okay that you have some too,
Yeah.
right? And then that can make you happy and can make you like me, right? So benign narcissists can be well liked from that perspective, but it's still all about them, and that can change if, for example, there's a scarcity of resources now, right?
Yeah.
But they're not people who are being overtly destructive, although that they're over the border into the envy territory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Malignant narcissists are very different, where they then want to have everything. So even if I have 1,000 times more than you do, I still envy you what you have, because I want to have. I don't think I can feel good enough about myself unless I have everything.
Mm-hmm.
And once I have everything, I won't feel good enough about myself either, and then I'll have to have more, right? It's like that's malignant narcissism, which we think of as sociopathy, right? As, again, we can define these words in different ways, but they're very, very negative concepts. That's profound sociopathy, malignant narcissism, envy writ large.
So sociopathy is malignant narcissism. That's a convenient way to think about it.
No, because we can do sort of sociopathic things but not be sociopathic. Like, well, we
Right.
tell a white lie. It's like sort of sociopathy on steroids, right? Is then, envy writ large is malignant narcissism.
Well, just like you're saying, like there's empathic attunement, as you said. So there's the mechanistic aspect of empathy and sociopathy, and then there's the big label you get attached if you're just doing that thing regularly, I guess.
Living your life through that lens,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
And is there a nice spectrum that's like narcissism, sociopathy, and psychopathy? Is it all the same kind of nice stroll through the woods off the cliff? Or
Not really, because the words don't have clear definitions like psychopathy and sociopathy. There's no real definition of psychopath or psychopathy. Right? Does that mean someone's sociopathic but psychotic? Like, there's really not we end up using those words colloquially,
Mhm.
right? Which is why concepts that we can define, like envy, empathic attunement, narcissism. Even though there might be nuances and definitions, like we can define them in ways that are widely accepted, including within psychology and psychiatry.
So it's nice to just think about this broad umbrella of narcissism and the levels to which it's benign or malignant, and then also separating into the different mechanisms, like interaction by interaction, which sometimes can be narcissistic, but broadly speaking, do you do everything through the lens of malignant narcissism? That makes you
Right.
a sociopath or a malignant narcissist.
Yes. And the thing I would add to that is the thought about culture, right? It's like, how does the cultures we're in, whether it's the culture of a household, right? The culture of a community, the culture of a nation or the world, right? How does that impact what unfolds in that person? And then how does what unfolds in that person impact that culture?
Well, that's the question is what unfolds in that person. Yeah. How does culture affect it, but how does your own psychological development unfold that? Because narcissism in leaders is the most impactful thing, right? Who are the most impactful individuals? Well, what is the most impact of individual psychology we have? It's usually leaders of countries or leaders of major organizations and so on. And one of the things you mentioned with benign narcissism, that seems to be aligned with success, right? If you care about your own success, that's going to be, you're more likely to have narcissistic tendencies, I suppose. And so my question is, when you follow that thread of narcissism to become the leader of a country, now you have a lot of new, interesting psychological complexities to deal with, like power. That old cliche that power corrupts. Is it possible for power to corrupt the human mind to where it pushes you farther and farther into malignant narcissism, into this destructive envy? What are your thoughts on power, like the effect of power in the human mind?
Yeah. I think power is it's an accentuator, right? An intensifier, right? So I think it is true that there are people who can be sort of in a gray area where there are malignant narcissistic tendencies and behaviors, but there are also ways in which that person can think outside of themselves and think in a broader way and think sort of kindly about others, and they're sort of trying to navigate, whether they're aware or not, that they're trying to navigate between one and the other. And then the allure of power is, well, just exercise that power and you'll feel better, right? It'll show you, right, that you're good enough. Look at the power you have, and whatever may be going on in the person's mind, that then power, yes, can corrupt. Yes. And I think that's why we have to have checks and balances, right? Because we don't, we are all inscrutable to ourselves, let alone to others. So we must have checks and balances, and we should always have them on ourselves as well as on others. We should want that for the health of ourselves and the world around us. So I think all of that is true, but there are also people who don't necessarily become corrupted by power, right? That there can be an understanding and a grounding that they're a steward of power, right? A shepherd. I mean, the ways people describe utilizing power and utilizing it in a benign way that then fosters the healthy aspects of self, right? So like gratitude and humility, right? If we could add a healthy dose of gratitude and humility to everyone or to our society, there would be a sea change, right? But how do you feel gratitude? How do you feel humility? Those things are incompatible with narcissism, envy, right? With the bad pole of things that we're talking about. And part of the reason I'm so focused in my work and in really what runs through all of my thoughts about life is the impact of trauma, right? Because trauma, creates these false lessons and it walls us off from truth, and it starts to point towards the unhealthy ways of trying to feel better about ourselves. But we have the health in us too. We have those seeds of health too that can grow into being a steward of power and sharing power and being considerate and kind. And we see a lot of that in the world too, right? It's not all just the evil. We see plenty of people who do good and who are generous of spirit. And, we have both in us. And it is, as I think you're talking about, our culture and what the seeds that we sow and the climate that we set, including putting governors and boundaries around, like, how do we rein in or say that the more aggressive, the more envious or destructive is unacceptable, right? How do we foster the part that's kind and considerate and reflective and slow to judge, of like, hey, let's learn a little bit more. Like, how do we foster that? And I think a lot of that comes back to early childhood education. I mean, I think we don't do nearly enough to protect children. And as a corollary to that, we don't do nearly enough to educate children. I mean, I want to write a book. Second book I write is gonna be everything I needed to know about life I learned as a second year postgraduate psychiatry resident. It's like, why? Why then did I learn so much about unconscious motivation, about the impact of trauma, about how we can be envious and how we can act out, even about how our emotions trump logic in us. Like, why don't we teach these things when we're young enough to understand? Like, why is that other kid bullying me?
Yeah.
Right? Or why, just because I'm a little bit bigger, do I want to go thump that other kid on the head? Like, what's going on? That we don't do those things. We're tripping ahead of ourselves, and we don't stop and think, how are we using our resources? How are we shepherding forward the next generation, which, by the way, is a generation that's going to determine our fates too, right? As we get older. But we don't do that. I often think of, like, in the Olympics, you see like the great sprinters, right? And they've got to come out of the blocks perfectly, right? Because if they come out of the blocks a little bit too fast, they're going to fall over, right? They're going to just fall forward. And I often see that in my head about us as, as humans and as a culture, that we're rushing so far forward. We don't stop and say, wait, let's keep the basics here, the basic techniques of, like, how are we navigating forward in life? Or do we just throw all those away because I can get some benefit by saying that you're bad, even though what's being leveled against you is wrong, right? Like, why? Why do I take that? Or do I say, no, there's something more important here that we want to shepherd forward in ourselves as a culture? And I think preventing childhood trauma and changing the ways that we educate children and adults could again make a sea change and maybe set us on a course towards, even towards a greater likelihood of survival as a species.
Yeah, so talking to, like, people in elementary school about human nature and teaching them how people can be resentful and envious, and how to deal with your emotions, how to just these basic interaction things about human relationships, about friendships, about betrayal, about love, about all those things. Like, it's actually strange that we kind of hope the parents talk about that kind of stuff.
Right.
But then the parents often, need therapy themselves.
The parents didn't learn it, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I'm not
right?
joking that I was mad.
Yeah.
Second year after medical school, like, how is it? Like, I think of even things in my own life, and how like, how much shame I felt after my brother's suicide. Like, I was already an adult, right? I was a young adult, but I felt so much shame. I didn't, like, I had no understanding that like, it's a reflex to trauma, right? To feel guilt and shame. And that, of course, I was feeling that. It didn't mean it was true because I felt it, but I mapped the fact that I felt ashamed to the fact that I should have felt guilty and ashamed. And it like led to some very negative things in my life that I had to sort of pull myself back from and recover from. And, like, I didn't know that, right? I didn't know the automaticity of the reflex and how pervasive it can be and how it can put blinders on us. And I mean, it's just one example, but it's an example of something big that happens to people that we don't learn about. And I find myself sometimes having conversations with a person. So, I still do a lot of clinical care, of having conversations with a person after a tragedy. And I'm saying, I can't believe, right? Again, I'm saying the things that this person didn't learn in elementary school, because, like, none of us did, right? And then look at the misery and the suffering. And then I think this is one person among how many millions among us who try and go about their way without knowing things that are easily knowable, because they don't even know that they're knowable because we don't teach them to ourselves.